Yesterday, north of 1,300 employees were laid off from the State Department as part of a much larger restructuring of the U.S. Foreign Service, which includes the dismantling of the U.S. Agency for International Development. I spoke to Enrique Roig. He is the Director of Policy and Strategic Initiatives at the Seattle International Foundation, who formerly worked for the State Department as well as USAID. These recent State Department layoffs, 1,300 folks that are involved, what do you think the impact of that will be?
Yeah, so Jaden, I think what I can say, well, first of all, yesterday was a really sad day, right? As you've said, there were 1,300 State Department career civil servants and Foreign Service officers who were let go. These are people that have worked in very dangerous countries on behalf of the American people to promote our national security. So these are technical experts who work on everything from energy policy to prevention of conflicts to human rights reporting to supporting civic activists, independent journalists, human rights defenders, people who have worked on really important negotiations to try and facilitate the end to conflicts around the world. So yeah, it's a lot of expertise, a lot of technical know-how, and people who also, speak 3, 4, 5 languages. So it's not something that you can easily replace, right? And unfortunately, the way it was done was so unceremoniously, right? People were given a notice yesterday by email. Secretary of State didn't even have the leadership or empathy to actually, have a town hall meeting with these folks, talk to them, let them know what's happening. He was out of the country. So, all of us that were there felt compelled to go down to the State Department and show our support for our former colleagues and friends.
There's something to be said about the impact that this could have on, of course, the U.S. soft power internationally, because this comes at a time when you have countries like Russia and China who are expanding their presence globally, as the U.S. currently is kind of rolling back its presence. What could be the implications of that?
Yeah, no, exactly. And we also have to remember that this also is happening at the same time that the U.S. Agency for International Development was also dismantled. So that was another part of our soft power, in addition to diplomacy and defense, right? So at the same time that we've lost that capacity, we've now lost a significant portion of our diplomatic corps. And as you've noted, at the same time that China is gaining influence around the world. And so we are really, we're being hamstrung essentially here. We've got conflicts going on in Gaza, in Ukraine, in South Sudan, Eastern Congo. These are places that require our engagement. The Chinese and the Russian, particularly in Africa, aren't shy about trying to gain greater influence through various means. A lot of economic interest there, critical minerals, other interests as well. And so, of course, it's in the interest of the U.S. to be engaged and involved. But unfortunately, we're moving in the other direction as we keep decimating our diplomatic and our development professional staff.
And you mentioned the U.S. Agency for International Development, which you served within that organization from 2010 to 2015. You actually did some work in South America. So could you explain for folks what that work involved and what the benefit of being there was in the U.S. interest?
Yeah, no, for sure. So I was the coordinator for the Central America Regional Security Initiative. So that program focused on preventing particularly youth violence, particularly violence related to gangs. As you know, MS 13 and 18th Street are two active gangs in Central America, which actually originated in the United States. And so our programs there focused on trying to prevent the recruitment of young people, particularly between the ages of 10 and 17, from joining into these gangs. Now, this also had the impact then of obviously looking to improve security, but then would ensure that people wouldn't want to migrate from these countries to the United States, right? So it was part of a larger strategy of addressing the root causes of migration, in addition to providing support on, economic development, for example. So again, losing that capacity really has a detrimental effect also in our strategy to prevent migration as well. It's like I like to say, we can't deport our way out of this problem, right? We also have to look at the reasons why people are leaving countries like in Central America. We know, like Venezuela, we've 8 million Venezuelans leave over the last 10 years. Many who have come here to the United States, many who have gone to Colombia, many have gone to Peru, Ecuador. So a lot of the programs that we were also implementing from USAID were also focused on providing support to those migrants, again, particularly from Venezuela, who were trying to resettle in places like Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. So all these programs at the end of the day are really a strong component of U.S. Soft power. But during this administration, we're really losing the capacity to do that work.
Investment in work overseas and just in different nations around the world represented a very small amount of the federal budget. And so, what would you say was the return on that investment?
Yeah, very small percentage. I mean, the USAID budget, is about 40 billion a year. That's less than 1% of our overall national budget. When you compare that to what the Pentagon receives, which is about $800 billion, and now will go up to 1 trillion under the new Trump administration bill. Very small percentage, right? And the return is significant. At the end of the day, what USAID was doing was providing humanitarian support around the world, in places like South Sudan, for example, or in Eastern Congo and Gaza, Ukraine. So, life-saving support to those populations who are being displaced because of conflict. USAID always, also provides important support around global health as well. So, life-saving medicines. The PEPFAR program, which was started under the Bush administration and has saved approximately 20 million lives, providing medicines there to prevent the spread of HIV. In addition to that, all the important work that USAID has done over the years on democracy and human rights promotion, providing critical support to activists and independent journalists and others who are battling authoritarianism in many countries around the world. And so, my bureau at the State Department, Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, also provided that type of support to activists and human rights defenders. And unfortunately, that's all been gutted now as well with this recent cancellation of or termination of staff.
And you provided that example of how in South America, USAID played a role in really preventing gun violence and just violence in general, because often that's the reason people migrate to the United States. What could be the downstream effects in terms of not having that presence there? Because, of course, now you see these impacts in these countries that eventually become the US's problem if the US doesn't want to engage early on.
That's correct. And, unfortunately, we're moving in a direction now on migration, immigration, where it's all about deportation, right? And like I said earlier, we can't deport our way out of this problem. We have to address the root causes of why people are coming to the United States, because they're not going to stop coming. There's reasons around economic, reasons for why they come here, because they're looking for a better life. There's situations like in Haiti, which, Port-au-Prince has been overtaken by various gangs. It's extremely insecure environment. So people leave there. People leave Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela because they're living under authoritarian regimes. And so that's not going to go away, right? So, it's a combination of addressing those root causes and also, looking for political solutions in places like Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua. So we also have to look at that part of the equation, right? Like this idea now that we're just going to try and deport 1 million people a year and somehow we're going to solve the problem is ridiculous. And also at a time when the U.S. actually has a shortage of labor, we're, somewhere around 3 million jobs that are actually required in the United States, that many immigrants provide important contributions, whether it's in the agricultural industry, construction, healthcare, nursing, meat packing, in addition to, all the intellectual sides of, whether it's, computer scientists and, people working on doing important research. So this country has thrived on immigrant labor throughout its history. So we can't, think that somehow we're going to, deport all these people and continue to have a growing economy, particularly because we have an aging demographic in the U.S. as well, right? So if we want to stay competitive with China, we need to be smarter about how we're thinking about this issue around immigration.
And on the topic of China and just US adversaries in general, is that who you imagine filling the gap?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the sort of the global context now, of course, you've got the Chinese who are, have an incredibly strong presence around the world. They have access to lots of critical minerals. They obviously have a very sophisticated, manufacturing apparatus. And they have a lot of influence around the world as well. And so definitely they are somebody that we need to be concerned about, and we need to be adjusting our own policies around our own economic policies and foreign policy to be able to match what they're doing both internally, domestically, and globally as well, right? So, and then of course India is another rising power, along with Brazil. And so we, again, we have to be much smarter about how we're going about, showcasing our influence and, winning allies and partners around the world.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the Trump administration have said these cuts are aimed at improving efficiency and cutting waste. Have you seen any of that in your time with either USAID or the State Department? And if so, would you have gone about addressing it the same way the administration has?
So, I mean, from my time at the State Department at USAID, as in any company or organization, there's always places where you can improve and be more efficient, right? But that doesn't mean, eliminate an entire agency or, do these kinds of massive cuts without much deeper consideration around the implications it has for the institution, right? So, in the case of the State Department, what happened yesterday, I find a bit ironic because when I was there, actually, we needed more staff. We were always short of personnel. People were working very long hours. Whether it was here in Washington or in at post overseas, diplomacy is a 24/7 operation. And so you need lots of people, personnel, who have the language skills, who have the technical expertise, who have the relationships in country. And so, Secretary Rubio's idea that somehow he's going to reorganize this and put everything under the regional bureaus and the embassies is um, a bit fantastical thinking, I would say. I think very soon they're going to realize that they have, um, dealt themselves, a serious blow, and I think they're going to come to the realization that they're going to have to start re-recruiting people. So it's going to become more difficult because I don't know who's going to want to go back and work in that kind of environment. And I really am concerned about the younger generation who want a career in the foreign service. I think folks that are looking at that now are going to be like, why would I want to go do that when I see what's happening under this administration? So I hope that doesn't happen. I hope that young people still feel encouraged to, do public service, and that the State Department and foreign policy continues to be a place in the future where they want to work.
And I do wonder, just in terms of the future for many of these workers, because I know you were out there yesterday, just talking with some of them. What do they say is next for them? Because obviously this was abrupt, but do they have an idea of what they could potentially be doing next? Because a lot of these jobs were very specifically public service jobs.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jaden. And that concerns me a lot because I think, given what already happened with USAID and the thousands of people that got laid off, I know for a fact that the job market here in Washington, particularly, is extremely difficult at this moment. There's just not enough. There aren't enough jobs to be able to cover the number of people who have been laid off. And then now, in addition to that, you've got all these other State Department folks who are also being laid off. And as you said, they have very specialized skills. So it's not always so easily transferable to the private sector or to the nonprofit world. And so I think a lot of them are extremely anxious and concerned about what comes next. And you've got people who now, were both, both spouses are now unemployed. One worked at USAID and the other one worked at the State Department. They've got small kids, they got mortgages to pay or rents, all kinds of other costs. And now they're looking at an uncertain future where they don't know where their income's going to come from. I've also heard of other people who were senior folks in USAID who are now, looking at working at, a coffee shop or waitering. I mean, it's gotten to a level where it's really quite concerning. But at the same time, I will say that also a lot of folks are becoming much more energized to see what they can do here in the United States to secure and promote our own democracy and protect what we have. So we've got a lot of very smart people who are looking at ways to become much more involved politically here in the US. And I think that's a huge asset for the country.
What do you think the federal government is losing and losing a lot of these workers in their experience and just knowledge base?
Yeah, I mean, again, they're losing a ton of experience and a ton of important skills, relationships that these people have with, host government partners, with private sector companies, with, the NGO world. These aren't relationships that you just establish overnight. And so we're losing a lot of that. And that's a huge part of diplomacy. It's those relationships that you build with partners, here and overseas. And so that's concerning to me. And of course, the technical skills, people that have, worked for years in areas of negotiation or energy policy or conflict prevention, on human rights issues, right? Um, so we're at a really critical moment right now in our country, and I think yesterday's terminations of almost 1,300 staff is just unfortunately another indication of, from my perspective, that we're really going in the wrong direction.